welcome all of you. My colleague, director of the Religious Freedom Project, Tom Farr, quoted John Courtney Murray earlier that it's actually an ideal and an achievement for creeds to contend intelligibly with each other. Sometimes our disagreements are not very intelligible or clear, so I hope that we will achieve, as we were saying earlier, some clear disagreement and clarify the lines of disagreement that were defined earlier today, but also map out and perhaps understand better some of the very interesting and important lines of agreement that were discussed earlier today between Professor Waltersdorf and Professor Masuda. First, let me thank both of you for your wide-ranging presentations, again, conducted with great clarity as well as civility. So thanks very much to both of you. Well, I want us to begin by talking about some of the areas where there was the most disagreement between the two of you, namely public reason and its demands and its relationship to the demands of religious freedom. But I don't want that to absorb all of our time because there are other issues as well. But I suppose it's the elephant in the room, given that it was the point that you focused on, Steve, in your remarks. So let me just ask you, Nick, to comment, however you'd like, on what Steve had to say, and saying, look, really, people mostly actually do appeal to public reason. One of your arguments was that you really couldn't see any prospect of many people accepting the Rawlsian deliberative norms. Steve says, look, even very religious people that we tend to think of as making biblicist sorts of arguments, actually are engaging in democratic deliberative norms. So what's the problem? Why is it so important to make the case that you were making about the Bardian with a small b?
Yeah, no, I don't see that most people appeal to public reason. I can't see that most present-day congressmen are... Oh, I was going to say, I don't see that most present-day congressmen are appealing to reason. Well, so my problem, so let's talk about that a little bit. Steve, I've never understood why common ground is important. I do think what we should do in the liberal polity is aim at agreement on policy. But on that point, I'm inclined to agree with the Gaussians that people can, who cares in principle, I mean, provided they're responsible views, but otherwise, who cares in principle why people converge on a common policy? What's important is that we try to get convergence on a policy. When we don't, and usually on significant issues we don't in a liberal democracy, of course, we vote, and that seems to me at least to be a crucial part of it. So take the natural law people. I don't see how they fit into your scheme because they're not. As you yourself observed, and as Paul Griffiths, who is a good philosopher theologian, observed, in fact, there's not agreement on natural law, even though it doesn't appeal to explicitly religious premises. Nonetheless, goodness knows there's not agreement on it. But I think they should be free to use common law arguments and inhabit the mind of other people insofar as possible to try to get them from their own standpoint to agree with natural law conclusions, but let them do their own natural law thinking. So I don't see the need for common ground. What's
right? Well, I mean, look, I think one thing that's important is that when we pass a law, in a way, that's only the beginning. Then we have to interpret the law, and we have to administer the law. We have to revise the law, but there'll be lots of rulemaking and so on that follows from that. And if we don't have any, I mean, just it's a practical point. It's not as deeply principled a point as others, but I think this all does make practical sense. That if we don't have any sense of what the law was for, if we don't have any sort of common sense, we're very unlikely to interpret it with anything like common purposes and so on, to be able to make sense of it, administer it, and so on. I think the other thing is simply this too. The fundamental point, I think, is a legitimacy point. I think it's very important that political power be exercised on the basis of reasons that that we're presenting, and that we can all see that there are reasons for the law. It helps to reassure one another that our fellow citizens are not just committed to particular policy outcomes that we agree with, but to ongoing deliberation on the basis of reasonableness. I mean, that seems to me a fundamental norm of democratic legitimacy.
But if I could interrupt with you, doesn't the Bardian, as described by Nick, conform to reasonableness? This is a person who engages in an effort to understand other points of view.
And
as you described the Bardian, he listens to criticisms of his point of view, but he's just not persuaded. I mean, in a way, like the critics of the new natural law you were saying, or talking about, well, they just don't find that position persuasive. Well, the Bardian doesn't find the secular critics of his position persuasive. And therefore, what canon of deliberative democracy is he violating?
Well, we live in a religiously diverse, this is all, well, I have nothing to say about this. This isn't sort of obvious in a way, and I'd be curious to hear what other people have to say. We live in a religiously diverse community. On this particular issue, the Bardian may be arriving at a reasonable standpoint because Nick describes him as or her having a liberal democratic agenda of some sort. But, there's something in general worrisome about somebody that believes the law ought to be used to enforce their own religious worldview, given that there are many people that disagree with that religious worldview, and given that there are many people that reject it, don't share it, and so on. Now, it happens to be the case that they're supporting things that, in fact, there are good common reasons for, and that seems to be the case that Nick has in mind. Then it doesn't make that much difference, but it becomes worrisome when people support things that only have justifications within sectarian worldviews. So I think to think about it is practically important. We'd have to think about cases where it really matters, and it would tend to be such cases.
But isn't the kind of disagreement you described just characteristic of all disagreement? What you've described is not special with respect to religious disagreement. Libertarians and welfare state types have very, very deep disagreements about the nature of the individual and so forth.
Well, they have different disagreements about how to think about liberty and how to think about equality and the role of the state in securing liberty and equality. And they have different predictions about the consequences of government action. So in fact, those are disagreements that are tractable and that we can sort of argue out in common, and they don't depart. Look, this isn't about us all agreeing. And it isn't us all about coming to the same conclusions, but it's very important, I think, that we try to focus our disagreements on grounds that we can talk about, like with marriage, the interests of children, the harm that it will do. These are interests of common concerns, and partly simply that we're talking about making law for the whole community, applying the law to the whole community, coercing people in the name of this law that they will disagree with. And it's a sign of respect to other people to give them reasons, not just that one thinks are true, that one thinks that they may be capable of regarding as true. It just seems to be a moral requirement of respect in a democratic society to try. Now, if one has the view that the truth is simply something that can't be grasped by people who one disagrees with, and the truth is hugely important, and that the only conscientious course is to insist upon the truth as you see it, you're liable to believe that those others are corrupt in some way, that that there's some failure on their part that makes it impossible for them to see the truth, then indeed one has conscientious reasons to proceed on that basis. There may have been people that couldn't see that slavery was wrong, and I think that people probably could see that it was wrong. But if something really seriously is important, then of course one will feel personally warranted in insisting upon some particular truth that corrupt others can't see. But that's not generally the case in our democracy, and I think we do far better to proceed in the way that we have been proceeding. And I do disagree with Nick about the extent to which people tend to conform. And I think it's good for our democracy because, let me put it this way, I think government is a very important instrument for the common good. And one of the things that contributes to its functioning as an instrument for the common good is that we're capable of deliberating collectively when we can, not at the moment in Washington, obviously our politics is broken, but deliberating collectively on the basis of common purposes that we can appreciate, continue to work out, and pursue and perfect over the course of time. And it seems to me norms of shared reasoning are an important part of making it work.
Now, you don't disagree, Nick, that there may be a prima facie case, as you were saying, for the kinds of shared norms and civility that Steve was describing,
Right,
but it may not be. But it may have to give way to an ultima facie, an more ultimate claim or rights claim of religious individuals.
Yeah, well, suppose we distinguish between the reasons we have for some policy and the policy itself. I certainly think that when we engage in a liberal democracy and political discussion, we should aim at arriving at an agreement on the policy. I suppose in some ideal universe, we would also agree on the reasons for our agreement on the policy. But it seems to me the really important thing is to aim at agreement on the policy. I find it, and then as a matter of fact, what we find in our society is natural law theorists like Finnis and Robbie George and Ayn Rand libertarians and utilitarians and Kantians and here and there my Barthian and so forth. So my view is let them start from what premises seem right to them. Aim at consensus. Give your own reasons, inhabit the mind of the other person sufficiently to be able to show, if at all possible, let that person also, the convictions of that person lead to the same conclusion. So aim at agreement on policy. But in democracy, as a matter of fact, on big issues, we almost always fail to reach agreement on policy. Mm-hmm. So I think, for me, voting has a greater importance than I think it does for Steve and for the Rawlsian tradition in general. Aim at agreement on policy. I've never seen the point of insisting on agreement on grounds or reasons.
Well, I think I certainly agree that it's more important in most instances to get people to agree to the right policy than to get them to agree to the right reasons. And if the only way to argue someone over to the side of civil rights is to invoke the Christian beliefs that they ought to share and argue that this is inconsistent with their religious convictions, so fine.
Then I'm going to do that.
Yeah, fine, absolutely. So it isn't a question of saying that that the reasons are more important than the conclusions, but I don't see how. I just don't understand how politics would work if large numbers of people had the attitude that Nick has, which it seems to me they manifestly don't. It isn't just a matter of deliberating and voting, it's a matter of parties. The Republican and the Democratic Party advance differing visions of the common good, which they themselves have to arrive at within those multifaceted, huge, diverse organizations on the basis of hammering out some differences and advancing some sort of agenda for governance and so on. That itself is going to require common deliberations, so people can see that they support a common policy and then see something of the common principles that lead them to support it. But in the deep background, of course, Nicholas and I agree that people will have different ultimate convictions about how to think about our place in the universe, religious truth, various philosophical questions, and so on. But a common set of political principles and some sort of common rationale for them seems to me of practical importance, and it seems to me very much how things work.
I just want to push you a bit, Steve. I mean, doesn't that point of view give greater weight to concerns like political stability and consensus than freedom? I mean, don't we, for example, think it admirable when people on the basis of conviction say, no, I'm not going to go along with that position of the state? We think this is the classic conflict in Antigone. Creon issues a decree that's not unreasonable. Traitors to the state shouldn't receive proper burial. That's not unreasonable. She says, no, I'm going to do that anyway. And in fact invokes a kind of transcendent duty and therefore a right to perform what is in fact an act of very grave disobedience to the state. I mean, looked at that way, aren't there many cases where individuals are under those kinds of circumstances? And don't we respect, as a matter of religious freedom, their right and their duty to, the Bardian to say, well, no, I actually feel deeply obligated to invoke my religious convictions as not just the primary, but the ultimate basis for my views on public policy. Isn't that to a certain degree admirable? And just for the sake of freedom, don't we have to make space for that sort of view?
Well, let me say there are two different perspectives on this. One is the perspective of someone being asked to comply with the law, or perhaps even to themselves take part in being an instrument of the law, such as military service, or being required to comply with the HHS mandate or something of that sort. Then I think it's very important that we appreciate the burdens that the person feels that they suffer, have to bear on account of their conscientious beliefs. Those would be questions about accommodations or exceptions and so on. On account of my beliefs, I bear a much greater burden than others who don't have these particular beliefs if you require me to do X, Y, or Z. So in those contexts, it's extremely important for us to sympathetically understand people's religious point of view, philosophical point of view, or whatever to assess whether an unfair burden is being imposed as a consequence of the shape of someone's beliefs. But when the question is different, and in a way prior to that, it's rather what should the law be that's going to impose on everyone in the community, then I think the common point of view is one that we have an obligation to take. Because we're making law for other people. We're making law for other people. And the question is, and this is, do I care about whether you have reasons for what I'm suggesting the law should be imposed on you? It's a matter of other regard. I care not only that the law is justified to me, I care about whether it's justified to others. Mm-hmm. So that's why looking at common considerations is important. And not just think about it from my perspective, but think about it from our perspective. Mm-hmm. It's a we-regarding standpoint. It just seems to me to go without saying that when it comes to lawmaking, we want to think about what the common interest is, what the common good is. Again, I just think this is kind of anodyne.
What do you think?
So I agree very much with what Steve said just now. It's not only that I've got good reasons for accepting the law, but whether you've got good reasons for accepting the law.
They don't have to be
but
the
I
same
don't see
reasons,
that those have to be the same reasons.
Well, to some degree, they can.
I mean, it'd be nice if they were the same reasons, I guess.
They can be somewhat different reasons.
But what do you say to the charge that the Bardian is not as other regarding? As
is not what?
Not as other regarding that the Bardian.
Oh, sure.
Is not,
the Bardian drives. I mean, my fictional Bardian.
Yeah, your fictional Bardian. Right, I'm talking about. Yeah.
Does his or her best to achieve agreement? Sure. And so I put it like this: has his own way of thinking, just as a Kantian has his or her own way of thinking.
Right.
But also cares very much about, if possible, convergence, consensus, and so tries to inhabit the mind of the other person and tries to find arguments that start from the premises of the other person, which lead to the same policy conclusion. So does his best to do that.
Right. So as far as I can figure, this is a kind of consociational model of politics, I think is what it's called.
Yeah.
We operate within different
exactly.
Faith communities, other sorts of communities, and we seek a consensus at the top, as it were, on the law, but not on the deliberation going down.
Exactly.
You know, and consociationalism is associated with a variety of problems, not just problems of stability, but I mean, problems of negotiation. There's no common negotiation. I mean, you could run a department this way, you could run an institute this way, where people more like we always think about a legislature as being more like the United Nations. You know, where we're coming from very different points of view. It wouldn't be a Berkeyan model in which we come and deliberate together about our common good. It's rather that we have our own perspectives, and then the question is just, what can we, for our own very different. But I just think it's a strange way. If one bases one's politics on sort of deep suspicion and disagreement, and I guess if one is operating from a deeply, almost non-judgmentally, a deeply sectarian point of view, where one, again, is insisting on the entire truth as one sees it within one's faith community. And one's not willing to go along with common deliberative institutions with people who have different faiths, but rather one is only willing to negotiate with them, to common ground. That would be, it seems to me, an extremely unfortunate political situation that would make collective governance for important political questions impossible. And we're very much at odds with the way the Constitution's been conceived from the beginning. So where the most important purposes were.
So it's by no means just religious people, or even primarily. And nowadays it seems to me as convinced libertarians who are most convinced.
Right. Yeah, there's the Nozikians, who have some deep sense of inviolability, that being taxed to support common purposes is using them as a means to other people's ends.
Right.
Is the view. Right. I mean, that seems to me to be, it seems to me to greatly exaggerate the incursion on individual liberty that is a result of taxation. But in any case, yeah, it's a kind of, it's an uncivil and it's an undemocratic point of view if one regards the democratic community itself as an important community of shared purposes. And again, the Catholic tradition in general has gone along with this, that the political community has its own important sphere, its own important agenda, and the deliberations there should operate on the basis of accessible reasons. But if one regards the political community as unimportant, as corrupt, deeply corrupt, and as a font of falsehood and so on, and regards the whole truth as simply within one's faith community, one's sect, one wants to separate as much as possible, and this other model of public deliberation, we're not going to call it public deliberation, but politics of negotiation, I can see how it would have some appeal. I just don't think that's, happily, I don't think it's the world that the vast majority of Americans live in, and I don't think we'd be a better place for it.
Well, I'm sure we'll get more into this when I get the audience involved, but I want to just for a few minutes turn to some of the bigger claims that you make, Nick, in your paper concerning natural rights and religious freedom as a natural right. This whole notion that there are natural rights and that religious freedom is among the natural rights is actually pretty controversial. Jeremy Bentham is famous for saying natural rights are nonsense built on stilts. Yes. But then we have more recent critics of the whole notion of natural universal rights. You mentioned some of them, Nick, in your paper. What would we lose if we stopped talking about religious freedom as a universal, inherent, natural right? And let me just, by the way, in this context, quote George Washington in his very famous letter to the Hebrew congregation at Newport, Rhode Island in August 1790. He says, "The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation." To that extent, he thinks the policy is universalizable, if not universal at the time. "All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it were the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights." And he's, of course, talking about rights of conscience and religious liberty rights as inherent natural rights. What do we lose if we stop talking like that, Nick?
So it seems to me that the very idea of a right, and in particular then of a natural right, is that if I've got a right to some good, that has a certain peremptory quality in my assessment of various goods. If it's a good to which I don't have a right, then in deciding to go for it, or somebody else deciding whether or not to dispense it to me, we weigh up a variety of goods. If the status of religion were simply that or at most that it's a good, then it seems to me what religious people like myself have to say is often it's not a good. In many cases, the religion that in the form in which it takes is a pretty horrible thing. And even if it is a good, one is a Stalin or a Hitler or a Pol Pot or whatever, and you weigh it up against some supposed greater good, some classless society off in the future that we will perhaps achieve if we sacrifice this good of religious freedom and so forth. So it's because it's got this peremptory quality. If it's a prima facie right, it can be outweighed by other rights, but it's not outweighed by other goods. Mm-hmm. So it may help if I mention autobiographically how the importance of rights first became very clear to me. I was sent by the college at which I was teaching, Calvin College, in 1975 to a meeting in Potchefstroom, South Africa. The meeting was not about apartheid. But there were Afrikaners there, some English-speaking people, some so-called coloreds and blacks from South Africa, plus a contingent of South Africans and some of us from North America. The Dutch were very well informed about what was going on in South Africa and were very angry about it. Furthermore, the Dutch can understand Afrikaans and the Afrikaners understand Dutch. So the Afrikaners could not say, as in those days, they said to most everybody, well, you don't understand. They couldn't say to the Dutch, you don't understand. At most, they could say to the Dutch, but you're so judgmental. Why are you so judgmental? Okay, so after some heated exchanges between the Afrikaners and the Dutch, the so-called blacks and coloreds got up, began to speak up, began to speak of the indignities that were daily heaped upon them, both in mass and separately. I was astonished, I shall never forget it, at the response of the Afrikaners. The Afrikaners, and they issued a cry for justice, the blacks and the coloreds. The Afrikaners responded by saying, justice is not the issue. Benevolence is the issue. Then they talked about their private acts of benevolence, and they described apartheid as itself inspired by a visionary benevolence. There are 11 or 12 different nationalities in South Africa. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they each found their own cultural identity? But they can't find their cultural identity if they're all mingled through each other. Hence, they got to be pulled apart, apartheid and so forth. I saw benevolence being used as an instrument of oppression. And it was because the Afrikaners recognized no brakes on their benevolence. So one way of putting it is, rights are a brake, among other things, they're a brake on paternalistic benevolence. They say, count up all those goods, that doesn't make any difference. That's, I think, why the notion of rights are important.
What do you say about that, Stevie? You commented to me, you're not sure how much work this natural rights language really does, and I mean, you did say you don't disagree with it, but
Yeah,
is it not important in the ways that?
Oh, I think Nick is absolutely right that rights have this peremptory quality, that they establish a social world in which we can make certain demands on one another, not as a basis of benevolence, as he said, or request or submission, but rather we can demand certain things, demand forms of equal status and equal treatment.
I
and
take
so
it
on.
that's what Washington was saying in distinguishing between toleration as an indulgence that's granted to the minority by the majority versus the inherent natural rights of mankind.
Right. So it's important to get clear what the rights are, and neither to interpret them too narrowly or too broadly, and so on. And in public life now, often the questions are one of various complicated interests that implicate rights in certain ways, but contours of how those rights are going to be defined given various kinds of rights of others, regime of equal rights, or public purposes of one sort or another that are also quite weighty and quite important, and may actually be partly about securing the rights of children or the rights of third parties who aren't involved. So I just don't think the language of natural rights or the idea of natural rights is sufficiently clear in its contours to solve or even to provide much traction on the issues that we face in a liberal democracy, where in a way we've conceded that individuals have important equal basic liberties. We need to think about the interests that inform those rights, their weight, and how they interact with other interests on the part of the political community and interests of other people. So rights are ways of making good on those interests that we have, but generally conflicts about rights need to refer and weigh those interests that inform the rights. And talk of natural rights, I have a natural right to X, is just a way of saying that the government would be illegitimate if it infringed upon it. But what we want to know is, well, is that so? It's more of a conclusion, I guess, and I just don't think the language of natural rights is all that helpful. The language of rights is helpful. The extra endowment of natural doesn't really make that, I don't think it, because after all of these things have to be sort of, even Locke said, we enter society with a contract, and the basis of unanimous consent, at least to start with, and then consent. And questions of what are the legitimate conditions that should apply to government power in order to make that consent legitimate, and so on. So we need to be able to justify these rights to one another. State of nature. We need them to be thought about in ways that we're all prepared to acknowledge, and that comes with a process of public deliberation, public argument, and then probably some decision through public authority.
Though there are some recent moves by a number of fairly prominent legal theorists. Brian Leiter, for example, has written a book called Why Tolerate Religion, in which he says, look, there really shouldn't be any well-established, respected right to religious freedom as such. The rights that we think of as being protected by religious freedom can better be protected, as you were pointing out, Nick, or paraphrasing, referring to, not directly, but referring in general to this kind of view. Why not just protect freedom of speech, freedom of association? Religious people can be protected under those things. Do we lose anything if we don't have a specially carved out right to religious freedom? Noah Feldman has said something along these lines too. Steve, what do you think about that?
Well, we'd have to work it through in detail. It may be the case, and often seems to be the case, that religious convictions have a special kind of non-negotiable quality for people in the context of their lives. They can be a source of conflict that other kinds of rights, claims, interests often aren't. My colleague, and actually president of Princeton now, Chris Eisgruber, has a very good book on religious liberty. His former colleague, Larry Sager, where one of the things they observe at the beginning is none of us really have any sort of abstract philosophical claims about neutrality, liberalism aside. Nobody really has any serious problem with the National Endowment for the Arts or National Endowment for the Humanities and so on. But if there were a National Endowment for religion, that could be a source of greater conflict as to exactly what sorts of government support. Now, I'm not 100% sure. We do give tax-exempt status to religious groups, and we do argue these things out, but it may be the case that religious convictions have a special kind of, can be a especially fertile source of conflict. Certainly historically that's been the case. And so but I think it's very important that we take a broad view of religion, and that in effect the regime of equal rights that we build up around religious claims are ones that secular analogs can also claim, secular convictions that are equally deep in the life of a person, whether it's exemptions from the military draft or participation in other kinds of programs. But that seems to be sort of common ground. We have to define these deep and serious convictions that have the place in people's lives of religious beliefs as also being included within this. Then I think most people wouldn't have a problem.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to say on that, Nick?
Well, suppose that religion is roughly what Nagel suggested it is. Then it seems to me to say that the only relevant right is the right to free speech is a very reductionist, but an almost weird take on it. I mean, this is not, when you look at what Nagel says, this isn't speech that he's talking about. I mean, it includes speech, but it's not speech. It's how one interprets, an interpretation of the universe and of one's place in it, of a certain style or mode or whatever, in which, as I was emphasizing, valuation is a deep component. So it seems to me, to think of it in terms of speech just strikes me as off target.
Not robust.
I think speech, I think speech is in its own right very important, but I'd want to think of it along different lines.
Well, you'd have to include associative freedoms and other kinds of things that would be, and the question would be whether, special exemptions or special privileges or special burdens in particular cases, exclusions in particular cases make sense. And I think often we shouldn't be singling out religious communities as compared with other kinds of expressive communities. Generally, the equal liberty interests apply quite broadly.
That I certainly agree with.
We shouldn't be singling out religious groups either for special privileges as compared with other conscientious communities, value communities of some sort, or special burdens. It ought to be part of a regime of equal.
On the way here, I walked past a building, it looks like a rehabbed old church building, and the sign said, "Community of Divine Science." Now, I have no idea what the community of divine science is, but it seems to me, they've got the same rights as the Catholic Church does.
Let's invite those in the audience who are eager to jump in. Yes, please.
And it said, "Here you will find your true self."
That's the divine part.
I'll just ask you to just quickly identify yourself and then ask your question or pose your comment.
My name is Addie Mena. I'm with Catholic News Agency and EWTN News and a former student of Professor Macedo's. So,
oh, really?
Hello again.
Oh, wow.
Yes. I like public policy. So.
Oh, great.
My question is, who gets to decide what the common good is within society? Who gets to set the language for which we talk about the good and determine what exactly is owed to persons within society, within the bounds of justice, and what rights truly are?
Yeah, I mean, we all do. It's a democracy is a short answer, and the questions The question become, I think, the interesting questions are the limits of the public good. You know, is there a legitimate public interest in supporting certain kinds of policies or programs that some people regard as controversial? Marriage is the thing I'm working on now, so there are those who say that, well, the entire institution of marriage is really too judgmental, that it violates some norm of ethical neutrality that the state ought to be required to comply with, and therefore the liberal state ought not to have marriage, it ought to have some sort of contractual regime or what have you. I think when one works through those arguments, they're wrong. There are public interests in marriage, and marriage has a well-recognized public status, and those are perfectly reasonable public interests that we have in two-person monogamous marriage, funding for the arts, and so on. There are arguments, you know, around the edges. I think the important arguments are what are our common interests, what are the limits of common interests, and how do we go about justifying them. But in democracy, we all participate. We participate as members of civil society as well as citizens exercising our political power. So did you have something more specific in mind, or a controversy, or some?
I guess it's when there's competing definitions of what the common good are,
Yeah.
and when we have completely different language for discussing what that good is, how, as a society, is it even possible to basically get on a common ground with using the same language and therefore being able to determine the limits that you were talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the case. I mean, with respect to the current marriage debate, there are those who want to say that really the core interest here are the interests of children. Marriage ought to be child-centered. Maggie Gallagher argues that very strongly. David Blankenhorn also argues it, though he's shifted his position on same-sex marriage. There are others who want to put more emphasis on the interests of adults. Now, that's not exactly different languages, but they're focusing on different, you know, sources of value. And then the question is, how do we actually work this out in practice? I mean, it seems to me that they're both right. I mean, children's interests may well, and I think probably do come first. And if same-sex marriage was going to be bad for children as a general matter, then I think David Blankenhorn would have a strong argument. I don't believe it's really the case. But it's also the case, and he acknowledges it, that adults have an interest in marriage. People get married intending not to have children. They get married after they're no longer capable of having children. It's obviously hugely, deeply significant to adults as well. So sometimes I think one thing that worries me about this conversation a little bit is that we can only get so far talking about these things in the abstract, and then we need to get into particulars. Because how do we work this out? Well, we should just look and see how we do work it out, or how we don't work it out. I don't think the current, and certainly the current conflicts we have in Washington are not really at that high level of abstraction. They're much more particular debates, I think, about the limits of our collective responsibility, say to the least well-off, and so on, and the requirements of a thriving economy and all of that. But I think the language is perfectly common. It's the interests that have pulled apart to some degree.
Other questions, comments? Yes, Tom Farr.
Well, I don't believe either one of your lawyers, right? Which is why you're here. But
No, I've never been tempted by that.
that's why I really like you, Nick.
Sorry, I mean,
But I want to
lawyers
ask
are
you a
fine.
question that has to do with law. It really, I think, plays into what you're talking about, and Steve wants to be specific. Let's talk about gay marriage and the Prop 8 decision. Here we had 54% of the people of California. I don't know whether they were Bartians or not. Are there that many Bartians in California who voted in a referendum to make marriage in California law between one man and one woman? This was overturned on a number of grounds at the first level, including the ground that this is sort of a Rawlsian argument, that there were moral and religious grounds for overturning it, and then it went on up through the courts, as you know. But again, this kind of goes back to the first question. Who decides what the common good is? What is the basis on which any reasoning, and much less the Constitution, overturns a democratic decision on that basis? And I'd like to ask both of the panelists to deal with that.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
So, Tom, my view is that in a liberal democracy, if we're behaving responsibly, and an issue comes up pertaining to the common good or justice, public justice, we don't just give speeches to each other. Maybe sometimes my position sounds as if we just give speeches to each other, but, and then take a vote. But I don't mean that. We engage on whatever basis we find compelling, be it natural law or libertarianism or Mybartian or whatever. We engage in discussion about that issue of the common good and or public justice. But in a liberal democracy, we always do that within the framework of the Constitution. That's a crucial part of it. It's not just that we talk together and vote. We do the talking and the voting within the framework of a Constitution and of the procedures outlined in the Constitution. So in that case, the court decided to strike down the proposition, right? And whether they were, we can talk about whether they were right or wrong about that, but that's faithful to the basic structure and procedure of a liberal democracy, it seems to me. Similar thing is going to happen eventually with, religion and the Affordable Care Act. So always, for me, it's always, I think whenever I've talked about this, almost whenever I've talked about this, I've said or implied within the framework of the Constitution. But about 5 years ago, I had a discussion with Habermas, and he had not heard that qualification within the framework of the Constitution. And then for autobiographical reasons, he was very alarmed. He remembers growing up in Nazi Germany when there was, in effect, no constitutional prohibitions whatsoever. And so it was, especially in discussion with him, that since my discussion with him, I've been more emphatic in saying that it's always, for us, it's always within the framework of a constitution.
Right, a legitimate constitution.
A legitimate constitution. I'm taking that. Yes, I'm assuming ours to be ours to be legitimate. Right. So certain things are off the table, and it's up to the courts then to decide what's on the table, what's off the table, and
well, but I'm surprised at your answer, Nick. If I
really?
could just jump in, because yes, I said you weren't a lawyer, but you punted to the Supreme Court. What about the democratic activity of the people of California, and what about the First Amendment, which guarantees the free exercise of religion?
But so, do you think that, so suppose 54% of the people of California mandated Christian prayers in the public schools? But that, I mean, do you think that all rights questions ought to be settled by
No, but perhaps the question of marriage should be.
Okay, well that's sort of specific to the merits of that particular issue, and I tend to agree with you for the moment. But some people will think that there are principal questions there having to do with equality. And that's what I believe in the fullness of time, but I'm happy to see it work through legislators for the time. I mean, I think it's very important that legislatures involve include some considerable scope to deliberate about these things. At the state level, courts and legislators often sort of interact more, and part of what's going on will be sort of state constitutional issues as well as federal ones. So I don't know. One can argue about the details of these cases. I kind of like the federal court that limited that ruling to California, but the electoral process is itself flawed. And I think courts, I agree with Nicholas on this, courts play a legitimate role in our democracy. It doesn't mean we're always going to agree with the cases that they played. I mean, here's one where there have been some real backlash issues. The Hawaii decision in '93, huge backlash after that one, Federal Defense of Marriage Act, that was obviously deeply imprudent. But if one sees the merits as requiring that ultimately marriage equality is a matter of justice and equal rights, then obviously one is going to be more sympathetic, not necessarily, but one is likely to be more sympathetic to judicial outcomes that nudge us in that direction. But I think it's very important that these things come about insofar as they can, democratically and with collective approval over the course of time. But we have to think about. I think we all. It sounds like you agree with the role of the courts. It's just that you disagree on the merits of this particular issue. Okay.
Well, I do disagree with the role of the courts, especially Justice Kennedy's finding of the Defense of Marriage Act, that a law that was passed just a decade before the finding, those who supported it, who were virtually everybody in both parties, including the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, are now people guilty of hatred, of animus.
I'm not crazy about Kennedy's opinion, that's for sure, but it was a, it was a political decision in part between the two cases there. I basically agree with the outcome, and he was threading of various needles, so I don't think anybody thinks it's a particularly satisfying opinion.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Yeah,
Fair enough.
but Tom, you're not saying that the result of a referendum should always stand, are you? I mean, some referendum might be absolutely horrible.
I guess the question is whether Judge Walker's reasons, and let's just say that one.
But that's getting into the details of the case as opposed to
that's
the.
right.
Well, that's
Which
what
I
I'd like
think
to
is the
do. I
situation,
mean,
yeah.
we need to get into the details of the case. And if the finding is that people who judge marriage to be between one man and a woman are wrong because they are religious, which was the,
No, that's not.
that was precisely part of the reasoning.
Well, the main argument, as I recall the case, was evidence concerning harm to children, which they, the fact is the case was very poorly presented by those defending Prop 8. I mean, David Blankenhorn is actually quite
clearly
good
the
on
case.
these,
But I'm
quite good on
speaking of
these
the ruling
issues,
of the
was not
judge.
very good as an expert witness.
Right. I agree. We agree on that. But the ruling of the judge, including the proposition that because those who supported traditional marriage did so for religious reasons, therefore, this finding was unconstitutional. It wasn't the only basis of the reason.
That just seems to me preposterous. I mean, just gross error on the part of the court.
Well, it's a view.
Any other questions, comments? Yes, sir. Right here in the front. Yeah.
Al Milliken, Andy,
Wait for
Why
the
don't you
mic
speak in the
here.
mic?
Yeah, it's coming along here.
you brought up the arts and common good. I'm wondering if you had reaction in the past. For example, the art of Piss Christ. Where did you see freedom, artist freedom, religious freedom in a situation like that? Also, our government claiming a film, challenging Islam or questioning it, is the reason for tremendous violent outbreak. We can go back to the Reformation times when Martin Luther was challenging the money being, the indulgences, supposedly getting people time off in purgatory. I remember St. Mary Ignatius explains it to you. There seems like, there's always going to be people offended, particularly when you're dealing with truth, eternal truth. And artists, have a responsibility to do that. I mean, people in religion do that. But if it is offensive, why can't those offended, challenge that peacefully? I mean, why is that? Why does the right of someone to speak the truth, or even attempting to speak truth in error, why shouldn't that be protected?
I don't think there's any disagreement on that, is there?
It should be unless it threatens public order, safety, and security, whatever. But otherwise, it should be protected. Religious people and anti-religious people should have the right to annoy each other.
Here, here.
I think there was a question in front, Professor Alone. Yeah. Wait for the mic. Yeah.
Ilan Alon from Rollins College. My question is, I think I've heard the term liberal democracy used at least 20 times during the speeches. And it seems to me that a great number of people in the world are actually not living in a liberal democracy. And the debate centered around, on the one hand, the common good, on the other hand, individual rights and inalienable rights for the individual to practice religion. How does this debate apply to places where common goods are not determined by the common, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, where collective rights, or the rights of the collective, are more important than the rights of the individual?
Thank you. You don't want to.
Well, it seems to me that one can have. So religious freedom comes in degrees and different configurations, I was saying. So you can have religious freedom of a sort in non-democratic situations. As I understand the ancient Ottoman millet system, Christians and Jews had freedom to practice their religion and to conduct family affairs and so forth on their own. To my mind, what structurally made it profoundly different is that there was establishment of Islam. It's the blend of guarantee of religious freedom plus no establishment that gives a special character to religious freedom in the modern West. But you don't need democracy for a millet system, for example. And as I say, the Christians and the Jews, and certainly the Muslims, enjoyed a substantial amount of freedom there. But there were positions they could not hold in government if you were Jew or Christian, and you had to pay extra tax, as I recall, and so forth. So it was establishment combined with degree of free exercise.
But probably not equal free exercise at some level.
No, but substantial free exercise
Yeah.
on the part of
Yeah.
Christians and Jews.
Yeah.
And they were, by and large, as I understand, not terribly restless
Yeah.
under that arrangement.
Yeah.
But historians know that better than I do.
Steve, how would you tackle the question?
Well, I mean, the extension of this tradition of rights that Nick was talking about is human rights. And so, what do we want to say in criticisms of regimes that rate certain collective interests higher than individual rights? Well, one of the things I'd argue is that I think there isn't any conflict. I mean, in certain very difficult circumstances, they can be hard to sort of apply rights in the same way that we do, but the human rights tradition stands for the idea that legitimate governments ought to respect certain basic interests that
Right.
individuals have, certain
Right.
basic rights, and
Right.
it's a criterion of legitimacy. And
Right.
if they don't,
Right.
the international community should be concerned.
Right.
And exactly what you do depends on the particularities of the case, sanctions, whatever, criticism, whatever. If you're dealing with China, it becomes a sticky issue as compared with other countries. But I think the human rights agenda is, I wouldn't want to equate those with natural rights necessarily, because they also have to get refracted through international organizations and what we think international organizations ought to be involved with. But that's a hugely important development and extension of the rights tradition that Nicholas was talking about.
That leads me to ask about the challenge of trying to promote religious freedom abroad. I mean, to the extent that religious freedom is a universal human right, whether we call it natural or universal, it actually is part of U.S. policy to promote religious freedom, as you mentioned, Nick. In fact, today is the 15th anniversary, today and tomorrow, of the passage of the International Religious Freedom Act, passed unanimously by Congress exactly 15 years ago. How much of a priority should this be for the United States? It's a standard of legitimacy. Steve, you just suggested, you've written a bit about universal jurisdiction and these kinds of issues. How important should it be, and what are the challenges of promoting this right abroad?
Well, I think it should be very important, but I can't, I won't hazard to give any kind of clear answer about what the challenges are. I haven't studied this particular rights question enough to do so, but I'm sure, along with other rights, it indeed should be a part of I'm in favor of the human rights dimension to our foreign policy, insofar as we can do things to actually advance it.
And what do you say? I mean, there are lots of fashionable critics of this policy. Some of them Nick mentioned, people who say, look, that imposing religious freedom really is a kind of instrument of domination, as a sort of Foucauldian critique of these Western notions of freedom. How do we respond to these kinds of concerns and criticisms? Steve and Nick?
Well, I would eventually, probably not in the first paragraph of my response, but eventually try to distinguish between the natural right as such and what I call the particular contour, and I'd make it clear. It's taken a certain contour in the West by virtue of lots of things, by virtue of the character of religions that we've had to deal with in the West, and the particular plurality and so forth. So each society has to carve out its own particular contour of the civil right to religion. But then it seems to me, religion for religious people, and odd religion for people like Dawkins and Dennett and so forth, is such a deep part of who they are as human persons that one violates them deeply, very deeply, if one says, you may not practice it, we're going to put you even under pressure to renounce it and so forth. That's a deep violation of the human person. deeper than just not letting them assemble. Well, I mean, right to practice religion, right to assemble are, of course, very closely connected to each other. But so I think it's hugely important. When the Copts are put under severe pressure in Egypt, that's a violation.
Yeah, I'm not sure, I'm not familiar with the Foucaultians who you're talking about, but there are people that always worry that certain standards emanating across national lines or other group lines stand for some sort of homogenization or power. Well, I mean, I'm personally in favor of homogenization when it comes to respecting basic human rights, the ones that are well thought through, representative institutions, legitimate government. If we all become more the same, with respect to those sorts of things, that's no loss. So, it's a question of trying to get the substance right.
Yeah, Professor Hollinger, is that, yeah.
David Hollenbach.
Hollenbach, sorry, yes.
One of the interesting questions for both of you, I think, is how you conceive on the, how do you conceive limits to the right to religious freedom? And on what ground? I mean, Nick Woltersdorf has got his sort of lowercase Bartian. At what point, if ever, does that person's right to religious freedom get limited? Because I don't think the right to religious freedom is an absolute unlimited right. There are restrictions at some point. A case in point, a Bardian South African who thinks apartheid is demanded by the interpretation of the Bible.
Yeah.
It's clear that you don't agree with that.
Right.
And you think that person's right to religious freedom should be limited.
I'm going to do
Why?
I'm going to do my best to prove him wrong.
Okay, but I mean, apart from persuading him, what if he isn't persuaded? Then what do you do?
Do my best to get my fellow citizens to vote against him.
But I thought you said he should be able to exercise his right in public.
Equal right.
All right,
Equal
but
rights.
all I'm trying to see is where and how the limits.
Under the limits of a legitimate constitution.
Okay, but
So within that framework,
he had a constitution in South Africa
But it wasn't
That
legitimate.
was-
that said that apartheid was legitimate.
that was one of the problems.
Well,
I
we
know
should,
it was.
We should
That was
remind him
one
of
of the
what Lincoln
problems.
said.
Okay.
Not just about slavery, but it would apply to apartheid too. So there's certain fundamental principles that make a constitution legitimate, including the basic
Right.
equality and dignity of all persons. And the question is what we do in response to people that are serious. Now, I think you have other cases in mind, probably harder cases. I mean, the HHS mandate thing.
Exactly.
It seems to me a bit of a stretch, I'll just say, for for-profit businesses to claim a serious free exercise infringement of being required, along with other for-profit businesses, to provide these contraceptive services. Now, I can see that going either way, and as I understand the policy, I've studied in detail, there are exemptions for religious nonprofits and religious organizations and so on, but drawing the line at for-profit businesses is within the realm, it seems to me, of legitimate democratic discretion. It becomes a tricky matter if people really, decide to resist and so on, exactly what we should do. The how do you respond questions are tricky, and it makes a huge difference what people are claiming. I mean, Christian Scientists really not wanting to treat a child for a bowel obstruction, that's a terrible thing. Right. On the other hand, you want to be very reluctant to remove a child from the home and so on. So mandatory schooling laws have often been kind of under-enforced in various places. We ultimately have to hope that people go along. But you know as well as I do that this is a very fraught area, and I'm suspicious. I agree with Nicholas on this. I'm suspicious of very general formulas. We do want to try to accommodate people's free exercise convictions when they're consistent with the regime of equal liberty. But there are certain important collective purposes we have, which are often about attempting to secure equal liberty, and then some of the conflicts can be very hard, and they can be hard cases.
Right.
We teach the same hard cases, I'm sure.
So David, I would say that when we've got a constitution, which we didn't have in South Africa at that point, but within the framework of a constitution, then indeed the right to religious freedom, free speech, assembly is not an absolute, but what I call the prima facie right.
Okay, I
And from
agree.
there on, I guess we've just got to argue the cases in detail.
I guess
There's
though,
not
that
some big-
I'm
there's
really,
not some
what I'm
big
really
general-
pushing for here
Yeah.
is, reaching the agreement about the Constitution
Yeah,
is going to require a kind of common ground among the people to get that constitution going, so that
Yeah,
in order
yeah.
to do that,
Yeah.
the limits on this lowercase bardian that you've been referring to, he or she already has to have agreed to some kind of common ground
Yep.
in order to maintain your position, as I understand you to be putting
So
it forward.
in my view, it was
It's a
providential.
both and rather than an either purely religious argument or a public reason argument, I think
Right.
is the way I'm interpreting what you're
Right.
saying. Is
So
that
I think it was
correct?
providential that the kind of constitution that we do in fact have emerged in the 1780s. I'm not sure that it would emerge today. But then
can say
we
that
argue the details. But
Yeah, okay.
if some private employer is on religious grounds opposed to all surgery, all cutting into the sacred body of a human being, would we say that he can exempt, in his health care policy, he could exempt all surgery? I doubt it. So it's not it's a prima facie claim.
But I just,
Yeah,
it sounds to me like you're agreeing more than you're saying.
I think we probably do. Yeah.
On this one, so far as I can tell, we are.
Let's take one more question. Karen Ruprecht, did
I
you-
know that Tim wanted to find points of disagreement.
Thank you. I'm Karen Ruprecht. I'm a graduate student here. I actually had a question related to the gentleman's question here about liberal democracy. And don't misunderstand me, I wouldn't argue against it. Nevertheless, it does seem a bit parallel to natural law in the sense that, as you said, Professor Macedo, it's internally persuasive or something akin to that, but it's not clear why you must accept that particular system.
Except what, liberal democracy?
Except, yes,
Okay.
yes, speaking about natural law, and I'm arguing it seems a bit parallel. Liberal democracy does. If you live in a country that has no experience
Right.
with liberal democracy,
Right.
nor necessarily desires it,
Right.
but is perhaps very religiously convicted.
Right, right.
Now
I agree. Look,
religious freedom is a very different
Yeah.
thing.
No, I was operating, a lot of my arguments, because we were arguing about, I think, the United States and within the American constitutional framework, I was referring to liberal democracy because that's how I would characterize ours, and I think Nicholas would agree. But it's a separate question of what are the requirements of legitimacy on the global stage for a regime to be a perfectly respectable regime in the family of nations. There I would refer to another book of John Rawls, which is quite vague and schematic, called The Law of Peoples. But I think it's actually a pretty good book. I tend to agree. A lot of people don't. But he says it's possible to have a perfectly legitimate state with an established church. And he uses the example of it's quite idealized, but it's still recognizable Islamic Republic.
Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan, he makes it up. Yeah, he makes it
right.
up. Michael Doyle says there are, he thinks that some of the Gulf states, qualify. But you could favor the established faith in certain institutions, certain offices, and so on. But you'd respect minority rights, have representative institutions, so that the law that's made reflects everyone's interests, and so on, and so that religious minorities are treated very fairly. In fact, what he wound up arguing is you really have to bend over backwards to be fair to religious minorities, so they feel included in the regime. So I don't think it's a government. I don't think societies have to be liberal democracies to be perfectly respectable. It's a separate question in a way. How we think our politics should be within our constitution, I completely agree with Nicholas, but other people within other traditions have some discretion. And China is not going to develop precisely. Hopefully someday it will be a legitimate regime, but it will be somewhere, hopefully, within that margin of discretion, perhaps reflecting some Confucian traditions, as some people argue there, or whatever. There'll be some differences. Think about Japan. There's quite a lot of differences out there.
So then in those contexts, will public reason actually, in a sense, be a form of religious reason? Given that that's the majority?
It could very well be religiously inflected, and I think in a sense that societies have their own public reason when it comes to having their own conversations in light of their own traditions about their own standards of legitimacy. There are certain commonalities, and human rights is supposed to mark some of the commonalities, the important elements of not necessarily right to vacations with pay, which is one of them, but sufficient time off and leisure and so on. So the human rights agenda and standards of global legitimacy are supposed to be those standards. They don't coincide with the standards of good governance democratic justice that we would endorse domestically. I completely agree with Nicholas. I think it's a very important point. There is a margin of discretion, but it's not an unlimited margin of discretion, and the human rights agenda is meant to mark that. So we need a global public reason, which is going to be distinct from the particular public reasons of particular societies, those of which themselves will differ somewhat, given the local traditions.
Well, thank both of you. Thanks to both of you very much. This is just the beginning of a conversation. We're trying to just get started here, and you've done a marvelous job, both of you.